Bonjour et bienvenue. Hello and welcome. I am Oonagh Fitzgerald, President of the International Law Association of Canada and Senior Fellow with the Human Rights Research and Education Centre and a visiting professor at the University of Ottawa. I am delighted to welcome you to this amazing panel of experts discussing Canadian and shared freshwater resources in an international context, a discussion of Canadian international legal perspectives. De la part de l'ILA Canada, bienvenue à ce webinaire intitulé Ressources en eau douce canadienne et partagées dans un contexte international. Une discussion de perspective juridique internationale canadienne. In keeping with Indigenous protocol and building respectful relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples of Canada, let me begin by acknowledging the traditional territories of Indigenous peoples. We are meeting virtually across Canada and well beyond, so I would like to acknowledge that the Indigenous peoples are the original occupiers, traditional stewards, and inherent protectors of the lands and waters called Canada today. Nous sommes reconnaissants de vivre, d'apprendre de cette terre et d'en profiter, et nous nous engageons à la décolonisation dans nos vies personnelles, nos entreprises, nos organisations, nos écoles et dans nos communautés. Les engagements que nous prenons dans cette reconnaissance de terre doivent être activement poursuivis et s'accompagnent de la conviction que la décolonisation commence par la réconciliation avec tous les peuples autochtones, y compris les Premières Nations, les Inuits et les Métis. The International Law Association of Canada, or ILA Canada, is the Canadian branch of the International Law Association, based in London, England, and founded in Brussels, Belgium, in 1873. Avec plus de 5000 membres dans le monde entier, notre objectif collectif est de promouvoir l'étude, la clarification et le développement du droit international, tant public que privé, et la promotion de la compréhension internationale et du respect du droit international. Comprised of legal scholars, legal practitioners, students, and policymakers, the ILA Global Network and its regional and national branches contribute to the work of ILA research committees and study groups on topics of international law. Last year, ILA Canada was pleased to host two ILA committee meetings, one on business and human rights and the other on the International Monetary Law Committee. ILA also holds biennial conferences, which are amazing. I recommend them. The last one was in Athens in 2024, and the next one will be in Vienna in 2026, August 2026. And ILA Canada organizes panels and workshops on a wide range of topics, just like the one we're having here today. So I invite you to visit the website of ILA Canada. Membership is free for students. We have a special rate for new practitioners and early career lawyers as part of our effort to continually renew and replenish this valuable global network. So logistics today, this panel is going to be presented in English, but you are welcome to pose your questions in French if that is easier for you. Vous êtes invité à poser vos questions dans la fonction des questions et réponses Zoom. N'hésitez pas à poser des questions en anglais ou en anglais, ou en français, excusez-moi. So you use the Q&A function to do that. And so at this point, it is my pleasure to introduce you to my colleague, Dr. Marguerite de Chaisemartin, who received her doctorate under Professor Stephen McCaffrey, former Special Rapporteur to the International Law Commission on the topic of the non-navigational uses of international watercourses. Marguerite has worked throughout various regions of the world with numerous governments, IGOs, non-governmental organizations, local stakeholders, development banks, and academia. She worked for several years in UNESCO's International Hydrological Program. She has managed transboundary water cooperation projects in the Euphrates and Tigris region and on the Nubian Sandstone aquifer system. She was an adjunct professor at the McGeorge School of Law at the University of the Pacific, and she served as a legal advisor before the International Court of Justice in the case concerning the dispute over the status and use of the waters of Silela. So with that, I pass it over to you, Marguerite. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Oonagh. We have a very distinguished panel with us today to discuss some really fascinating and very topical questions around international and Canadian and shared freshwater resources. We have with us Commissioner Phare from the International Joint Commission. Merrell-Ann Phare is a lawyer, writer, strategist, negotiator, and relationship builder who worked extensively in and with Indigenous organizations on environmental, land, water, rights, and governance issues. She, along with 10 First Nations chiefs, was the founding executive director of the Center for Indigenous Environmental Resources, a national First Nation charitable environmental organization. As chief negotiator for the government of the Northwest Territories, Mrs. Phare led the negotiation of transboundary water agreements in the Mackenzie River Basin and the creation of Taidenenene, a national and territorial park in the east arm of Great Slave Lake. She is the author of the book Denying the Source, The Crisis of First Nations Water Rights, and co-author of Ethical Water. She is a member of the Forum for Leadership on Water, Smart Prosperities Leadership Council, and is a recipient of Canada's Clean 50 Award. She served as legal counsel and advisor to a number of First Nation and Métis government and organizations. We also have with us today Nigel Banks. Nigel Banks is an Emeritus Professor of Law at the University of Calgary, where he held the chair in Natural Resources Law from 2008 until he retired in 2021. He is a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. Nigel also served as an adjunct professor with the University of Tromsø at the Norwegian Institute for the Law of the Sea between 2012 and 2019. Nigel's interest in international water law goes back to the late 70s when he was a graduate student at UBC working with Dr. Charles Bourne. Richard Kyle Paisley has a background in science and international law. He has taught at the graduate level at the University of British Columbia for over 3 decades, while serving as special counsel, international legal advisor, and mediator to a wide range of national governments, international agencies, multilateral development banks, NGOs, indigenous groups, and the private sector throughout Asia, Africa, and the Americas. Among other roles, he is special counsel to the UN Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs standby team of senior mediation advisors. He has published widely in the scholarly literature in the areas of international water law, hydrodiplomacy, environmental conflict resolution, mediation, and climate. And finally, Dr. Riley Denoon is the co-director of the International Waters Governance Research Initiative and a Canadian barrister and solicitor from BC and Alberta. He holds a doctorate in international law, obtained under Professor Stephen McCaffrey, former special rapporteur to the International Law Commission on the non-navigational uses of international watercourses. He has worked with the UN, governments, NGOs, local stakeholders, and private clients. His work and publications focus on transboundary watercourses in the international environmental law and dispute resolution. And he served as a legal advisor before the International Court of Justice in the case concerning the dispute over the status and use of the waters of the Silala. He was a co-editor of the Research Handbook on International Water Law. Thank you very much to our panelists for being with us today, and thank you to the people in the audience for joining us today. Bonjour et merci beaucoup à ceux qui sont présents avec nous aujourd'hui dans l'audience pour suivre cette discussion vraiment passionnante sur des questions importantes et d'actualité autour du droit international et des ressources en eau douce canadiennes et partagées. Well, I'll jump right in and start with my first question to the panel. What are the roles of existing institutions in the Canada-US transboundary water context, and how are they functioning? For example, the IGC, the International Joint Commission, has a long history of facilitating Canada-US transboundary water cooperation. how does transboundary water cooperation look like these days for the IJC? And maybe I'll ask you, Merrell-Ann, maybe to start with this first question, please.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for inviting me, and I'm really happy to be here. And thank you to all the people who maybe are calling in from different parts of the world for being interested in the Canada-US or Canada context. I'm in Winnipeg, Manitoba, which is right in central Canada in the Treaty 1 territory in the homeland of the Métis Nation. I've been asked to first explain a little bit about the IJC first, and then I will talk about the second part of the question, which is how does it look these days? So the IJC, it's been around for a long time. We tend to think of the International Joint Commission here as kind of a bureaucratic fixture, something that's just always been here, always will be here. But I'd like to reframe that and remind people that IJC is, I think of it as infrastructure. I think of it as much as, say, some of the key dams that manage the relationships between Canada and the US, like the Moses-Sonder Dam, which is very well known, manages all the water that comes out of Lake Ontario, is a shared structure between two countries. IJC actually manages the physical flow of political and legal flow, rather, of disputes before they become crises. If you think about it that way, that's our primary function. And at a moment when Canada-US relationships are under strain, I think that that shared infrastructure of cooperation matters more than ever. What is the IJC? It was created in 1909 by the Boundary Waters Treaty. That was a treaty between the United States and Britain at the time on behalf of Canada. So it's come across kind of like every kind of political weather since then. I think it was built for purpose for this exact type of world we're in right now, high conflict, and I'll explain that in a moment. But the structure of it is we have 6 commissioners, 3 are from Canada, appointed by the Prime Minister and Council, Governor and Council, and then in the US, 3 are appointed by the President, and that's by design. We are appointed not representing our governments. In fact, we take an oath that says that we don't do that. We are supposed to, I think of us as stewards of the treaty. We can vote to decide something, the 6 of us, but we tend to reach decisions by unanimous consent. And we work very hard, and sometimes things take longer in order to do that. We have 2 core functions. Under Article 8, we review and regulate physical water projects that affect levels and flows. And we are a quasi-judicial institution in that regard. We actually grant approvals and we give orders. We can impose binding conditions, and we can oversee compliance with those conditions. And so I think that makes us very rare in the world, that kind of an institution. Under Article 9 of the treaty, we investigate and make recommendations on specific water quality issues that have been referred to us. They're called referrals. And they ask us to investigate things usually to try to avert problems, or maybe there's a problem that already exists and we need to find solutions. And so that's what our institution does. There is not a specific water quality mandate. In the Article 4 of the treaty is a promise between the 2 countries to, sorry, there's a message there. Okay. Article 4 makes a commitment each country to not cause harm to the other country through water pollution. But that doesn't automatically bring in our institution, the International Joint Commission. It only does if governments ask us. And though our mandate on water quality has grown over time, you may be familiar with the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. It was first signed in 1972, then renewed in 2012, and that gives us a permanent reference to help both governments deal with the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the Great Lakes. We also, weirdly, have a bit of an air quality mandate, AIR, which is pursuant to a reference we got, and the 1991 Air Quality Agreement. I won't go into a lot of that because we're mostly talking about water, I think, but it is an interesting thing. Our mandate usually deals with surface water. Back in 1909, I don't think groundwater was something people talked a lot about. It certainly isn't mentioned in our treaty, but it has evolved to that. We have adapted over time, and there are a number of our boards that have a groundwater mandate in their directive. I'll just end this explanation about the IJC by envisioning us. We have 3 offices, one in Washington, one in Ottawa, and one in Windsor. And we have about 200 experts across 15 boards. So if you think of the Canada-US boundary, it's the longest political boundary in the world. It is managed through 15 or more boards with 200 people, many of them volunteers or appointed through their employers to assist us. Scientists, engineers, Indigenous knowledge holders, municipal, provincial, state governments, really spanning every transboundary region. And a range of mandates, as I said. Some are pure water quantity, others do have water quality mandates. And there are some areas we don't operate. The Columbia, for example, the Columbia River, there's a treaty that supersedes our involvement. We only have potentially a dispute resolution role there. Up in the Yukon, Alaska, northern BC area, we don't have a mandate there. So we have to be specifically asked. So that's the basic idea of what who the IJC is. And I'll just quickly take a few more minutes to answer the question about where are we now. So cooperation, I think, is resilient, and I want to give you 2 tangible evolutions in what the IJC has done to show that resilience, but also highlight some of the tensions that are very real that exist in our organization. We've evolved over time. Instead of thinking of the Canada-US boundary and the water that crosses it or is situated on it as a line, we have moved to a watershed approach, an integrated approach where we realize we need to take into account things that are happening along the whole watershed that the boundary bisects, not just the line. And so that is the right model. The watershed model is the right model. It doesn't recognize the political boundary, but it creates a governance problem right away because the domestic jurisdictions sometimes feel or wonder, are we doing their job for them? Are we trying to do their job for them? And the answer is no, we are not. What we have to do is work cooperatively with the domestic jurisdictions to try to ensure that along the boundary, things are meeting the treaty. So, but sometimes the friction around is IJC overreaching is a very real conversation. The second thing that I want to mention is a new referral that we got as of 2024, which some of you may be familiar with, the Canadians certainly would be, the Elk Kootenay referral. This is, I would call it, a governance innovation. In 2024, both governments, Canada and the US, in partnership with the Oonagh nations, there's 6 of them, 4 in Canada, 2 in the US, gave us a reference. So that in itself is the first time ever. The governments have never given a reference in partnership with Indigenous nations before. And this is to deal with pollution in southeastern British Columbia that is crossing the border. And the second thing that referral did is it gave us the thing we're used to getting, which is a study, a request to figure it out through science and technology to do a study on the problem and recommend solutions. But it also created something else called the governance body. And IJC is the secretariat to the governance body. The governance body is made up of representatives of the governments, so formal government representatives, Canada, US, Montana, Idaho, British Columbia, and the 6 nations. It's 18 people, all representing governments, who are charged with receiving the study board report and developing an action plan to solve the problem of pollution in the watershed. That's a transboundary water governance structure involving and respecting the authorities and jurisdictions of Indigenous nations. That is a very significant, that's not tinkering around the edges, that's a significant governance evolution. We don't know, we're partway through it. We have not seen it to the end yet. We are partway through, so we will see how this goes. But I just want to say, this is not an incremental improvement on an existing model. It's actually a different model, and it's exactly, I think, what is needed. So I will stop there, and and just hopefully that's give you a sense of the work we're currently working on in terms of the transboundary region on Canada-US. Thank you.
I think you're muted, Marguerite.
Yes, sorry. Thank you very much, Merrell-Ann. I'll have maybe a couple very small follow-up questions, but I wanted to see if any of the other panelists wanted to answer that question or comment on what Merrell-Ann just said.
I can take a quick stab unless Nigel or Richard would like to jump in before me. I found it very interesting. Thank you very much, Commissioner Phare. It was and I find the new elk reference to be a very interesting development of what's going on. But we'd done a study, a research study a while ago on dispute resolution mechanism, looking at 250 different mechanisms around the world. And one thing that kind of popped out of it was that there was the majority of these regimes used numerous steps in their architecture. And I think the important thing for that we found was that there was points of contact. And so the more points of contact you create and the more embedded cooperation that you create through the institutional architecture, the better opportunities to find agreement. And I think in an area as technical as transboundary water cooperation, which is really driven or should be driven by the science and the technical experts, I think you can find a lot of agreement through these various points of contact. We in the introduction, it mentioned that I worked on the Salala Waters case, and an interesting element of that case, Bolivia, just to provide a little bit of background, Bolivia's contention at the beginning of the proceedings was that the Salala was not an international watercourse, and Chile's contention, they were petitioning the court for a declaratory judgment stating that the Salala was indeed an international watercourse. And I think through the length of that process, through the various written pleadings that were submitted, and through the technical experts and their dialogue between them, I think you found the groundwork for agreement between the parties. Essentially, I mean, there was still a judgment. The parties went to final judgment without a agreement, but the court found that the parties' positions had essentially converged. And whether you view that in a cynical way, that it was a way to avoid an adverse judgment, but the court doesn't. The court views it that the parties' submissions are in good faith. And so the court found that, I think, through that process, and particularly through the expert testimony and the work of the experts on that there was ground for cooperation. I think the IJC's role and the institutions that Canada and the United States have is really important in that context.
I can, unless there's another comment, I can just add to that just a little bit, which is the points of contact. I think of that as, we have a governance structure, a set of, I often think of it as houses that have been built through colonization, and we need to change some of the foundations and some of the structures, bend the walls a little bit towards each other. And sometimes it'll mean create something new, but sometimes it'll actually mean, no, we need to recognize that there are spaces where we can just come together in a new way. We can recognize the authorities that exist and realize that by coming together in a thing like a governance body, and we don't know if it'll be a permanent body, the parties will decide what happens after the referral period ends, when the study is done and they've considered the work and they're going to do an action plan. And we will see how well this works over time. But at the end of the day, this idea of bring our jurisdictions to the table, whatever we have, we don't need to fight about that. Everybody's here. We all have something regarding water. None of us can go it alone if we want to solve the problem, because the water moves. And let's see if we can find things in common to build towards the solution we all need. And that's exactly what's happening here. And they're finding that they have to do what you're suggesting, many points of contact. The study board, everybody has to be on the study board, the governance body, all of the systems are adapting to this. It's actually causing lots of ripple effects, and it's costly, it's time intensive. I think those are some of the downsides of it. But we're hopeful that in a year or two from now, we will say, but it solved the problem. We moved the needle significantly on that issue.
Thank you. Yeah, Nigel, go ahead.
Yeah, maybe just a brief comment on the reference power. The reference power is clearly one of the IJC's great strengths. I mean, it gives it tremendous flexibility, and it's evolved over the years. But one of the challenges, as you know, Merrell-Ann better than I, is that it requires the consensus of both federal governments in order to initiate a reference. So it's wonderful to see the Elk Kootenay reference, but we all know we waited a long time for that. And we also know that in other cases, we simply don't get consensus on a reference. The Devil Lake scenario in North Dakota, and also along the Panhandle rivers between Alaska and British Columbia. So while I understand the point you made that the IJC doesn't have jurisdiction there, it doesn't have jurisdiction, I think, because there hasn't been a reference, would be my take on that. So I guess I wonder, will we ever move to the scenario or the future in which there's an understanding that if there's a bona fide case for a reference, it really ought to happen, rather than leaving each government with the opportunity to say no, often at the request of a more local government, whether that's provincial or state.
That's the one weakness in the treaty, I think, is that we have limited authority to truly prevent problems that we see coming down the pipe. We have to be asked. There is a way that each government we can get unilateral references, but I think people would see that as a failure of the treaty, that the whole point is to do things shared and have collaborative willingness to look at things. We have been asked by governments to kind of keep a watching brief on things that are coming down, but that's not a referral power. So yeah, I agree with you, Nigel.
Richard, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Just to build off what Nigel said, yeah, unless I'm missing something, the treaty doesn't say that both countries have to be unanimous in these things, that either country, in theory, could make a referral. Of course, they've never done it. But that sort of is another aspect of it. As you're probably also well aware, I'm sure you're well aware, ever since about 1988 and the Cabin Creek reference, there's been a certain amount of antipathy towards the IJC in Western Canada generally. And perhaps we could get your thoughts on that. Cabin Creek was an interesting case. That may well be part of it. Western alienation in general may be part of it. The lack of commissioners from the West through history could be part of it. And maybe there's other parts of it that I'm not aware of. But what are your thoughts, Merrill? Yeah.
I think I'm the first commissioner from the West in about 50 years. And so it is so much of the water along the Canada-US boundary is in the Great Lakes area. That tends to dominate. It's a huge economy. Most of the population is there. I can see why it gets the attention it gets, but also the Boundary Waters Treaty does apply all the way along the border, and in fact was created because of conflict that was coming out of Alberta, the St. Mary Milk, at the time. Right, there was a potential. I wouldn't go so far as to say a war, but close to it, between the farmers in southern Alberta and Montana. And so, I think it could have something to do too with the different forms of how water is allocated, the different water rights regimes also. There's a sense of really local entitlement, not, very defined allocation regimes, and that might create a sense too. But and as I just said, the IJC could receive a unilateral reference. In fact, there was one I think that we did receive a long time ago dealing with something in Windsor area, something to do with electromagnetic waves or something like that, that I don't think was completed. It can be done, but as I said, I personally would see it as a failure of the treaty because you're trying to reach a resolution and you need both parties to recognize that there's a question that needs to be answered. So we hope for always to have joint references, and that Elk Kootenay is a good example of how you get one. That was, I mean, over a decade, maybe longer, of advocacy by many people, but including the Oonagh. They were instrumental in having that reference happen. And that's, at the end of the day, it's a political process. The treaty exists, but it's a tool that has to be chosen to be used by the parties. And that's a political issue. And so if there's political will to use the treaty, then it will be used. And if there isn't, then it won't.
Thank you very much, Merrell-Ann. Do any of you have any other comments? I was going to start with my follow-up questions, and one of them is linked to a question from the audience on groundwater, but I think we'll keep that maybe for the end with what you just finished on political will, Merrell-Ann, and maybe try to move on to the next question. For now, which is linked a little bit to what you all have been discussing. So, are there ramifications, if any, related to the current geopolitical climate between Canada and the US for transboundary freshwater resources and transboundary water cooperation? And this time, I'll ask you, Riley, to go ahead first, please.
I feel a bit like I've caught the hot potato. I probably I think, well, I think one thing that's important to discuss is that there is an embedded history of cooperation between these two riparians. We're talking about the 1909 Boundary Waters Treaty. It's over 100 years old. We've had cooperation beyond that. I mean, it's also, I think important to distinguish between Canadian water and shared water. I think often when we speak informally, we speak about Canadian water in a sense as being, us owning this water, but in the broader context of Customary International, and I may invite the skepticism of some of my colleagues talking about the broader concept of, customary international water law beyond just this bilateral practice between Canada and the US. There's a generally accepted viewpoint that of this idea of community of interests between riparians, and that riparians share a water course, that there is a limitation to sovereignty in respect to shared water resources. Limited territorial sovereignty is the generally accepted rule in the broader field of international water law. And I think that's an important distinction, to think that, I mean, water isn't like money in a bank that we can put there and park there. Water moves. Water is part of the hydrologic cycle. It can become atmospheric water. It can flow elsewhere. Water that's surface water obviously flows. The Columbia flows into the US. So there's a practical tethering of our interests between the United States and Canada. And I think that exists regardless of political atmosphere. Certainly, it's been good for generating interest in transboundary water courses. I think I get a lot more phone calls of people wanting to talk to me or interview me. I did one local radio show in Columbia Basin where listeners were interested to talk to an expert because they'd had a lot of people calling in wondering if we could turn off the Columbia River, we could divert it, or we could stop it. Obviously, there's huge physical limitations to stopping a river of the magnitude of the Columbia. You could theoretically divert it. You would be in violation of international law and our agreements with the United States. But it's something that was actually discussed at one point during the negotiations, I believe, of the Columbia River Treaty or threatened by the Canadian side, that they might divert the Columbia into the Fraser River. But I mean, to shut off the dams, you would top the dams and it would flow to the US anyway. So I think this idea that it's our water is probably a misconception that we need to think about. I think there's certain elements of the relationship, certain people in the relationship talk about, there's been talk about a giant faucet in Canada. I think that elicited a lot of enthusiasm to talk about this. And I think for the same reason we can't guard the water, we can't be a fortress. We're also not a faucet, right? I think there is a reciprocal nature to our relationship, which is embedded throughout these institutions, which Merrell-Ann has talked about. The IJC, the Columbia River Treaty. We have deep connection. We have deep connections and cooperation in areas on the Abbotsford Sumas aquifer. It's more of a local aquifer there, but there's still technical cooperation between Canadian and U.S. elements. So I think it's more a story at the local level. People are used to moving back and forth across the border or cooperating on these watercourses. Yeah, there's some points of tension at times, but I think there's a general theme of cooperation, which it would be very difficult, I think, for a single individual or a movement to kind of untangle the root system of cooperation that's kind of evolved between these two countries. So I think, that would be my general takeaway. I think there's obviously some things that we need to think about, we need to be aware of. I think, we used to have the RBC used to conduct these water attitude surveys, and I think it was kind of interesting. And one of the main concerns Canadians had often was the export of water to the United States by Canada. And I think the idea that we would jeopardize our water security this way. And bulk water removals are, interbasin transfers, bulk water removals are an issue. I think the government of Canada took this into account. There was some licenses for bulk water removals granted in the 90s in BC. I think Sunbelt. Then the BC government pulled the licenses, and Sunbelt, California company, I think launched proceedings under NAFTA at the time. I don't know whatever came of that, but this isn't a new story. The Army Corps of Engineers put forward a long time ago the North American Water and Power Alliance in the 1950s to kind of divert water systems in North America and Alaska through the Rocky Mountain Trench, so it could be taken down to Montana and siphoned off into various rivers. It's kind of a James Bond villain-esque. It's a gigantic mega project that I think, for very practical reasons, never came to fruition. There's also the pending potential update of the review of the CUSMA Treaty, and currently water as a commodity has been accepted from the current CUSMA and NAFTA. It was left out. There was a particular exemption granted to it, and so I think as Canadians, I think it's important to be aware of the idea of bulk water transfers. There is various protections. There's the Transboundary Waters Protection Act at the federal level, the Boundary Waters Treaty, and the IJC are empowered to try to maintain the level of the boundary, so that any major diversions from boundary waters like that would theoretically have an effect. There's the Boundary Waters Treaty Act, which prohibits these bulk water transfers. There's provincial legislation like the Water Protection Act in BC. You can export water, but I think it's in a 20-liter container is the allotted amount. There's a few other exceptions. You can transfer it in, if you're a cruise ship, you can fill up your tanks and move. But anyway, I'll stop there. But I think it's something to be cognizant of.
Thank you very much, Riley. Would anyone like to answer this question or comment? Richard, go ahead.
Sure. Yeah, bulk water's always fascinated me because it's guaranteed to get headlines in any newspaper or on the radio or whatever. And part of it came about because there was a legal opinion that came out of a guy in Toronto, a lawyer, who was interpreted to say that if Canada ever sent water to the US, they'd be forever bound to continue sending water in perpetuity, kind of thing, which seemed to go against everything I've ever known about international trade law. And maybe Nigel and Cody and Merrell-Ann would want to jump in, but that got it going. And then the Council of Canadians and others got onto this, and that was the thing. The irony is we do send water down to the States now. How do you think Point Roberts gets its water? There's a pipeline, goes from Canada down to the United States. People just don't want to talk about it, right? But I think that at the end of the day, cooperation is where we need to be. I mean, it's a aphorism, but we're not going to solve these problems on our own, and we need to work cooperatively. And I was struck when I was in California this time last year by just how non-adversarial most of the people that I ran into were when it came to talking about water and energy issues, right? So what the government is saying on the one hand is one thing, but what the people at Stanford University and these other places are saying on the other hand is something quite different. So I think we need to separate those two things out. And I think there's real potential for moving forward. The problem now is that there's people in the US that are reaching out, wanting to work cooperatively, NGOs, both sides of the border, that sort of thing. But there's limited interest in Canada because we got our own things to do and because we're antipathetic to the US. Nobody wants to travel there, or a lot of people don't want to travel down there. A lot of people won't even buy American apples because they think that's they think that's a bad thing to do. It's an immoral thing to do. So we need to overcome that, or we're gonna that doesn't lead us to a good place, I don't think.
Thank you very much, Richard. Would anyone, Nigel, would you like to say something, or um, we'll
Maybe come back to it at the end.
sure. We Thank you very much for your contributions and the conversation we've had on transboundary water cooperation at the Canada-US level. If there's if you're okay to move on, then I'd like to move on to the next question, which I'd like to zoom in on a specific treaty, on the Columbia River Treaty, and ask how does the modernization of the Columbia River Treaty fit within the broader Canadian transboundary water landscape? And Nigel, I'll ask you maybe this time to go first, if you can talk to us a little bit about the process of this modernization and the content of the agreement in principle and the interim agreements, and please.
So thanks, Marguerite, and thanks for the opportunity to join this group today. I'm joining from southern Alberta, Treaty 7 territory, the traditional territories of the Tsuut'ina, Blackfoot, and Stoney Nakoda nations, and at the confluence of the Bow and Elbow rivers, part of the South Saskatchewan system. But Marguerite wants me to talk about the Columbia, so I will. And Merrell-Ann's already referenced the Columbia, and others have, and it is in a sense a carve out from the Boundary Waters Treaty. It's a treaty that entered into force in 1964. It doesn't completely exclude the Boundary Waters Treaty from application in the area. So I see that John Schertz has posed a question in relation to the levels order that exists in relation to Kootenay Lake, which is an old Boundary Waters Treaty levels order. But it does establish a special regime applying within the Columbia Basin. And when it was negotiated in 1964, principally concerned with two major values, power values and flood control. The treaty doesn't have a formal termination date, although as of 2014, in other words, the 50th anniversary of the treaty, it has been possible for either party to give 10 years notice of termination. That hasn't happened. However, There's one other sort of caveat in the treaty, and that is on the 60th anniversary of the treaty, September 2064, September 2024, one part of the treaty changed automatically, and that related to the flood control provisions of the treaty. And what happened in September 2024 is that the United States lost what's known as the Assured Flood Control Operation, which was an obligation of Canada to operate treaty storage that had been built under the terms of the treaty, 9 million acre feet of storage to provide assured flood control. The loss of that, and knowing that that was going to happen, I think focused attention on the need to modernize the Columbia River Treaty. And of course, once you put one thing on the table, namely flood control, other things get added to the table when it comes to modernization negotiations. And those included, in addition to flood control, the power sharing arrangements that were in the original treaty. The US was generally of the view that they were more generous than they should be. They were based on assumptions that didn't turn out to continue. There was also a huge amount of pressure on both sides of the boundary to address what's sometimes referred to as the third leg of the stool, meaning ecosystem function, which had not been spoken to at all in terms of the original treaty. And associated with that may be the possible reintroduction of salmon to the upper Columbia, an area that had been cut off from escapement for salmon since not the terms of the Columbia River Treaty, but the much earlier construction of Grand Coulee on the main stem of the Columbia in the 30s and 40s. But there was also a lot of pressure to include indigenous voices, the tribes on the southern side of the border, and indigenous nations on the northern side of the border, voices that had been completely excluded back in the early 1960s, and also pressure for enhanced Canadian control over the storage that exists in Canada to maximize perhaps values for recreational use of the reservoirs that had been created and to enhance ecosystem function in those areas. So lots and lots of issues on the table, may be triggered by the automatic change to flood control, but all brought together in negotiations that commenced in 2018. Negotiations, and we can talk about this more later, that did involve the nations and tribes as part of the negotiating teams on both sides of the border. So negotiations begin in 2018, some hiatus due to COVID, if you think about the timing, and the parties ultimately reached an agreement in principle in July 2024. But if you think about it, that's pretty late in the day, because our deadline that we're working with is the 60th anniversary. And that agreement in principle addressed all of those issues that I listed a moment ago. And one can think of it, I think, very much as a compromise document and a balanced document. So from July onwards, the parties were moving from that non-enforceable agreement in principle into translating that agreement in principle into treaty text. But I think the parties were also aware that we're not going to get there, or we may not get there in time either for the September anniversary, or of course the other thing that's looming, if one thinks back, is presidential elections in the fall of 2024. So there was a fallback, and the fallback was to put in place a set of interim arrangements, that were focused on the traditional treaty values. In other words, flood control and power. And those interim arrangements were put in place by way of exchanges of diplomatic notes and agreements between the so-called operating entities. So these are BC Hydro on the Canadian side of the boundary, and the Army Corps of Engineers and Bonneville Power Administration on the US side of the border. And those interim arrangements say what's going to happen in relation to the downstream power benefits that Canada receives under the treaty out for the next 20 years, and also puts in place a more limited assured flood control operation for the US in the form of an assured operation at the Arrow Reservoir, which is the reservoir behind the Keenly Side Dam, closest on the main stem to the US border. And Canada receives an annual payment of nearly $38 million for that assured flood control operation at Arrow, which is in a sense on a year-by-year basis. In other words, Canada must provide that operation if it receives the money from the US. That interim arrangement is only in place for 3 years, so it expires in the fairly near future. So the anticipation is that this is going to be a 20-year agreement, but that interim arrangement is only in place for a short period of time. So you might ask, what happened to the rest of this? Well, as I say, the parties did continue negotiating. My understanding is that they continued pretty much until the end of 2024, but were not able to get agreed treaty text together, and negotiations came to an end. The consequence of that, from my perspective, is that what started off as a very balanced agreement in principle became unbalanced when it comes to the interim arrangements. And what I mean by that is it's unbalanced really in two ways. Unbalanced in the sense that the US achieved significant success in what it was looking for. In other words, greater and more assured flood protection and more certainty, and perhaps a reduction, although that's contentious in relation to the power issues in the treaty. But it's unbalanced in another sense, that we lost everything else. We lost the third leg of the stool. We lost the creation of a joint environmental and indigenous body that was contemplated in the agreement in principle. And my understanding is it seems very difficult to get negotiations going on those topics. And, you know, one can speculate, maybe this is tying back into Riley's comments. One may speculate why that is. I mean, it may well be that on the Canadian side, no one wants to draw attention to the Columbia River Treaty and region. Perhaps it's best to postpone these issues for, let's put it this way, a number of years. And perhaps I've said enough to trigger some comments from my colleagues, or perhaps some questions we can come back to later.
Yeah, would any of you want to comment? I'd like to ask you, Nigel. I mean, it's yeah, a bit speculation, but do you have an idea how the process going forward might unfold, and how would you like it to unfold ideally?
I'm sure there are people on the call who are better positioned to answer that. From the outside, it's very hard to tell where things are going. As I say, my sense from talking to people is that absolutely nothing is happening right now. There will be something that the parties need to address, however, and that is what happens in 2027 when the short-term interim arrangements for flood risk management come to an end. I suspect that there will be pressure, perhaps from the US, simply to roll that over. In other words, to extend it for a longer period. I guess my hope is, in a sense, given that perhaps one of the goals here is to keep a low profile for the Columbia, maybe that's not a bad idea. But let's not use that pressure opportunity to completely put to one side all of the other important issues that were included in the agreement in principle. So if it's an extension, maybe a very short extension, and conditioned on making progress on some of these other issues. I mean, one of the issues is an enhanced compensation payment to Canada, which is an annual payment that's conditional upon reaching agreement on the treaty. That simply was booted down the road by the interim arrangements.
Thank you very much, Nigel. Go ahead, Richard.
Sure, thanks. Well, thank you. Nigel, as usual, has given a very thoughtful and articulate view of that, which I totally agree with. There's more cynical views as to how things transpired. I think one of the justifiable paranoias on the Columbia has always been that we'd get traded off for some bigger objectives on the East Coast, auto pact or whatever. I mean, in the bigger cosmic scheme of things with international trade. The problem with those conspiracy theories is they require a lot of organization and sort of on both sides. So whether that's true, but if you're a conspiracy theorist and you think that the West is getting traded off and sold down the river again, then there's ammunition there that you can sort of run with. I think it's very unfortunate that these so-called interim arrangements are likely to be permanent. I mean, I can't see what the incentives might be for the US to come back and negotiate anything. They got, as Nigel put it, everything they wanted. And the other stuff, well, that was great. But as he also pointed out, an agreement to agree, as far as I ever learned, was, first thing you learn in first-year contracts law, you may recall, is that an agreement to agree is no agreement at all. And so, if you're cynical again, you would think that maybe that was something was going on. So, whether we could have had a different outcome under different circumstances, I guess we'll never know. But I think that there was a lot of opportunity there, and I don't say it's squandered, but I think it would be nice to think that somebody's going to pick up the pieces now and try to move this forward. But I'm not sure that that's the case. The BC government, for example, has other fish to fry right now, including a huge deficit they have to worry about that they're justifiably preoccupied with. So I don't think Columbia River is going to be at the top of their list for a while.
Thank you.
Maybe I'll just say by way of response, I haven't seen any evidence of sort of trade-offs, right? Trade-offs within the basin, yes, but not trade-offs Columbia versus things going on in central Canada or elsewhere. I guess the other thing I'd say is that timing's everything, both in terms of the compressed nature of the negotiations post-July and picking, I suppose, the sweet spot in terms of restarting negotiations. And we've probably all got views about when that is best to happen. But I guess the one thing I'd say is the short-term nature of the interim arrangements on flood does give us, a key to reopen something. But I think it's also a question of when we use that key. Do you use it in coming up to 2027, or do you defer it? But my view would be if we defer it, then we don't defer it too long.
Well, the other thought that struck me, if I may, is that the original agreement came as a result, many people believe, of catastrophic floods. I mean, everybody talked about the power benefits and benefit sharing, but it wasn't until they had truly catastrophic floods on the Columbia that everybody's attention got focused on it. And maybe that's the way of the world. More catastrophic flooding or some other crisis might bring us back to the table. It's unfortunate to think that's the only way we can do these things, but it may well be the case. I mean, and with climate change and the unpredictability and extreme events and everything, I could see that as a very real possibility, right? So,
Go ahead, Merrell-Ann.
Nigel, I just wanted to point out a question in the Q&A directed at the interim arrangement. I don't know if you dealt with that one, but I did want to step back just a moment and talk about the bigger idea of just, do we stay quiet? Do we avoid this at a politically fraught time, or do we keep talking about and negotiating around water? I think that, I don't have either any experience where things are traded off. The IJC is under the not the direction, but the department that is mostly responsible for the IJC is Global Affairs Canada, but also Environment Canada. They have a relationship. So, we are within the context of a global picture within our federal government. But I think that the IJC itself, we just forget, I think, because we have not, most of us haven't been alive to see things like major world wars and huge conflict. Canada and the US, the US routinely talked about annexing Canada many times over the last 150 years, including at the time that the IJC was created, the Boundary Waters Treaty. This level of conflict that we are experiencing now, I don't think it's not at all unprecedented in our history. Maybe we just haven't, in our lifetimes, our professional careers, actually seen it. But I think I keep reminding people that our treaty was designed for this purpose. It has survived world wars and the Cold War and 9/11 and every cycle of trade friction since then, and we still have solved many, many problems. And so, to me, my personal view is we shouldn't shy away from elevating water as an issue. I just think we need to remember, I think the thing that's dominating everybody's thought is the economy. That's all. It's all about that and where water fits in that. It's only relevant in the conversation these days if it touches on the economic issue, right? Touches on our ability to address the economic needs of the countries. That's where I see the attention or lack of attention going. But I do think I wanted to tell you that the President of the United States, the White House, did a review, you may know about this, of all of the organizations that the United States was a party to, the international organizations, and it withdrew membership from many of them, I think over 60, which you may have heard of. And IJC was reviewed, and IJC was not on the list of organizations that it wanted to withdraw from. It sees the benefit in the cooperative mechanism that has held true for 115 years. And so I think we just need to remember that we can move through this period of conflict and use the institutions we have. We just have to be more flexible and innovative and creative in how we do that.
Thank you very much, Merrell-Ann. Yeah, I do think, water cooperation will endure despite, political, issues at the political level because of many reasons, including, physical, geographical realities and necessity. I don't know if anyone would like to comment on this. Riley, go ahead.
I don't know how much time you have left allocated for this
We
section,
have
but
to move on, and there are like a
okay.
lot of questions in the. But go ahead.
I'll try to be quick. A few things popped out to me. Our earlier conversation talking about kind of the institutional architecture that all of our interactions on transboundary water courses kind of operate in. I am reminded that the IJC, did play a really pivotal role in the initial studies that went into the formulation of what became ultimately the Columbia River Treaty, the initial technical studies. I think so. It's important to remember these aren't totally. I think there's obviously some regional differences, but it still fits within kind of this broader architecture in some senses, right? It still operates under the aegis of the IJC, and at least in theory, in some senses. And I also Nigel talking about the changes on the to integrate First Nation perspectives and First Nations into the negotiation of the Columbia River Treaty, or the modernization, and also to bring in kind of the third leg of the stool. And I think there's really important ramifications for that in the sense that with climate change, with what we know about local governance, I think it makes a much more flexible, more durable, more legitimate agreement. My question would be for the panel, I mean, or Nigel would be, do we know in the basin what the attitude is our basin residents or as particular groups, are they optimistic or are they, does anyone, I mean, not to make anyone speak for on behalf of the basin residents, but if they have any feeling of, or is there generally disappointment in how things have gone?
I think I'd say from conversations I've had, just disappointment that all that time invested in um, addressing these other issues um, and seeing them fall off the table. So disappointment, particularly perhaps for residents in the Arrow Lakes, Revelstoke area, but also perhaps folks who live in and around Lake Koocanusa, which is the reservoir behind the Libby Dam. But
Thank you,
Yeah,
Nigel. Go
I was
ahead.
gonna say when I
Go
heard
ahead,
this
Nigel.
this frustration when I was up there. I was up there on a ski trip a couple of weeks ago, and when I mentioned the Columbia, for those who cared, frustration, and then the usual propensity to want to demonize BC Hydro and blame them for everything, right? So
If I could mention too, like, I think it does create some question in people's minds because the elk reference, of course, the Kootenay is within the Columbia River Treaty. It's within that watershed, I mean. And so we have, an interesting governance evolution to deal with one area and then a broader approach that could look different or is suspended. We're not sure how it's going to go. So I think it's going to be an interesting time over the next 5 or 10 years, thinking about how did these things play out over time? Because I could see that there's great hope that there is, through this collaborative governance mechanism in the short term, though obviously it's not a long-term permanent commitment, but that real solutions can be found that are to that Indigenous nations and Canada and the US and the government of BC. You've got to hand it to the government of BC on this one because they, I think, had the most risk probably in participating in this and have been very open and willing and full participation. And so, how this plays out over time, whether the Kootenay outcome has any impact broader than the Kootenay, I think is an interesting question to track over time.
There is One comment in the there's a lot of questions asked. One comment is tribes in the US remain optimistic that a modernized treaty is possible to achieve and also critical to achieve. Before we move on to the next question, there's one question related to the modernization of the Columbia River Treaty, which asks, does the interim arrangement differ meaningfully from the called upon storage benefits embedded in the original treaty? I don't know if Nigel, you could reply very briefly before we move on to the next question.
Sure. Briefly, so the original assured operation was to provide about 9 million acre-foot of storage at 3 Canadian reservoirs. So the Arrow Lakes Reservoir, the most critical one for the US, some space at Mica, and some space at the Duncan Reservoir, which is actually a tributary of the Kootenay. The new assured, or they call it now a pre-planned operation, is for simply 3.6 million acre-foot located entirely at Arrow. So it's a reduction in terms of the assured operation. And the parties also, the entities also developed a new flood risk operating plan for that storage at Arrow. So a couple of consequences. I think the operation of Arrow isn't going to change very much as a result of this. But the other thing, in a sense, that's been lost by simply focusing on Arrow is that the old flood control operating plan had sections dealing with flood control both in the United States and Canada within the Kootenay system as well as the Columbia, and that's been kind of lost with this movement to focus on Arrow. So I think the parties, the entities, have got continued work to do on that. But that's yeah. So overall, a reduction in the amount of assured storage, but in return for this, a new significant annual payment to Canada instead of the one-time payment that was made back in 1964 of $64 million for 60 years of assured flood control.
Thank you very much, Nigel. It's a really, really interesting conversation. I have to move on to the next question now. Are there trends or lessons learned, either positive or negative, at the global level, or from other transboundary basin contexts that could be interesting and useful for Canada? And Richard, I'll let you lead on this question.
Thanks, Margot. As some of you know, I've spent a lot of my life looking at governance of international waters and trying to tease out lessons learned and experiences and try to decide what's hot and what's not, and what things need improvement and what we can learn from. It's kind of a daunting task. Some years ago, I had a major project with the World Bank and the Global Environment Facility and the private sector, actually. And when you look at the 260 plus international freshwater systems alone and an equal number or more of groundwater, it's quite daunting because there's great differences, legally, politically, socially, hydrologically, and you got to think, wow, how can I possibly compare them and derive anything? And so I don't claim any profound knowledge, even having spent a lot of time looking at this, but there were some things that are sort of seem to pop up if you're going to have a successful agreement, however defined, or successful regime, governance regime. And I can sometimes semi-predict what is likely to work and what isn't likely to work, and maybe some trends that it would be useful that Canada isn't. You got to remember that the Boundary Waters Treaty, of course, is very old, and the Columbia Treaty is no spring chicken either. So there have been developments since then where I think they've gone into some areas. So quickly, my observations were that benefit sharing was very important at some level, meaningful benefit sharing. And I think one of the successes, clearly the success of the Columbia River Treaty, leaving aside objectives and how it impacted Indigenous people and whatnot, was the idea that there was genuine benefit sharing, equitable sharing of benefits. And show me an agreement that doesn't have equitable sharing of benefits. That can be problematic or is problematic. Show me an agreement that does have equitable sharing of benefits to start off, then things are looking better. Data and information sharing and exchange is crucial. So the Columbia, again, another good example of that. I kind of, with a team of people, used the Columbia data and information sharing and exchange to help structure the data and information sharing and exchange for the Nile and also the Mekong. And so conflict prevention and resolution is really important. I think the mere existence of that usually is a harbinger of things. You don't even have to go there, but if you have it in your agreement, you're more likely. Show me an agreement where they try to take that out right away, and usually it doesn't work very well. But you and Riley are the experts on that. But funding also important. But I think there's a few things that some of the more I'd say Mark III and Mark IV agreements, everything from the Senegal and other places that have got into that we're still working on or could be working on in the agreements we have between Canada and the US. The Columbia is a good example. One, of course, is resilience and adaptability, adaptive management, the whole idea of adaptive management, right? Both in a scientific sense, and also in an institutional architecture sense, based on the proposition that whatever we do, we're probably not going to get it right because it's a very complex world out there. But if we can be adaptive and we can revisit and we can, adjust what we've done based on what we've learned from experience, then that's probably a really good thing. And I haven't, the concept's been around for a while, ever since Buzz Hollings sort of pioneered it at UBC in a scientific sense. But in an institutional sense, it's more recent, and there's limited places where it's been successfully implemented, but it's starting to happen in a lot of agreements now. So I really emphasize that. The other one is public participation. The Columbia, among other things, historically has not been a shining light for meaningful public participation on both sides of the border, let alone collaboration on both sides of the border. Although the First Nations and the tribes have gone some distance to try to ameliorate that a little bit. But institutionalized public participation, I think, is very important. And the other two that I would sort of target, one is what I call third party. And this is I'm hopelessly biased here, but third-party facilitation and mediation. In my experience, of course, that is my experience, is that where you have third-party facilitation and mediation, when you're trying to reach agreements and implement agreements, successfully implement agreements, that can be very, very beneficial. Not in all circumstances, you have to be careful, but certainly in many circumstances where the parties just having that experience and facilitation skills and mediation skills and ability to bring people together and work from interests rather than positions, you can't help but wonder how that might have impacted some of the agreements, even the Columbia, if they'd had that sort of arrow in their quiver when they were doing these things. So, and then compliance and enforcement. I mean, the world, as you know better than me, and Riley would know too, and Nigel and Merrell-Ann, there's all kinds of great agreements out there that look terrific, especially in Africa. Everything. I worked a long time in the Lake Tanganyika agreement, and it was a very well written agreement, written by very bright people, but there's no compliance, or very little, if any, compliance and enforcement. So I think in this world that we're entering now, we need compliance and enforcement. I'm not saying you have to have heavy duty compliance and enforcement, although that maybe in some circumstances that's appropriate. But at least that mindset that it's important to comply and it's important to have enforcement so that people actually do things. But anyway, that's your area of expertise, Marguerite. But I show me an agreement or an institutional arrangement or a governance mechanism that doesn't have compliance and enforcement, and you got to wonder. In my experience, it's usually not. More probable than not, it will not be successful. It won't be successful. So those are a few of the things that I think that. Personally, with the interim, what's happened in the Columbia, for example, with the interim arrangements and even the agreement in principle, I think they as near as I can tell, of course, we don't really know what the agreement in principle in detail because it never got fleshed out. But those things, adaptive management, dealing with climate control, public participation, the possibility of third party, it all got sort of it didn't happen. And I think that again, it's more probable than not throughout the world that these third generation agreements that are coming out now, that they're starting to have these things, and I think that's important. So let me that'll kick that off. I'm sure that'll give some people some comments. So
Thank you very much, Richard. Anyone would like to comment on the question of or Richard's answer? Go ahead, Riley.
Trying out my lower hand. I just a few things to that came up when I was listening to Richard. I think it's good to draw a distinction between ideal legal architecture and the practical realities. I think if you look at an agreement, Richard said not all good, great. A lot of agreements look great on paper, but they don't necessarily have implementation. But I think you look at an agreement like the Mekong River Agreement, I think everyone really celebrated it as a great accomplishment and really a perfect, in many ways, embodied a lot of the ideas of progressive ideas of customary international law or international watercourses law. But practical reality doesn't always line up with how it looks on paper. And for me, the idea that don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Where there is some cooperation, that's a good thing. I think even on another agreement comes to mind, the Indus, which has recently been put into abeyance, and a lot of people would say it's probably a failure at this point. But I think the Indus persisted for a very long time, even through very difficult circumstances, and the entities in that treaty continued to operate, continued to interact, even in times of armed conflict between the parties. And I think even now that India has placed the treaty into abeyance, it is still interacting in some capacity in regards to a neutral expert process. And so there's still these points of contact that you see. And so I think that, and I think the general thrust of customary international law, there's a lot of flexibility built into the architecture. They're very broad rules, and I think Canada also sees some of this. With the IJC, we have a broad architecture for this institution that can cover a lot of ground, and we have a lot of other. And so I think we being able to be flexible with our application, being realists as well. I think one of the issues that comes up when talking about the Columbia is the political reality of whether we want to, who wants to bring it back to life, this modernization process.
Thank you very much, Riley. Anyone else would like to comment on this question? Thank you very much, Merrell-Ann, for answering already so many questions. We have a lot of comments and questions, and I think the ones that remain will be interesting for the next question, maybe. So I'll keep them for then. I'll move on then to our next question, just to try to keep track of the time. I'd like to ask you all, what is the role of non-state actors in Canada in relation to transboundary freshwater governance? And maybe I'll ask you, Merrell-Ann, to start on this, and maybe Nigel afterwards. You could eventually. You've talked about it before, but maybe you could add something on this. Thank you very much.
Sure. So I will, of course, speak from what I've learned being a commissioner for 6 years, is that both in terms of the actual resolution of water problems on the ground, but also the attention that is given to those issues, that non-state actors are critical just generally as a broad category. And of course, the example 25 years ago, we moved from kind of an on the border kind of approach to water to in a few key places. We've got 4 of them, 3 of them are final, and 1 of them is a pilot called watershed boards. And then the idea of a watershed board is to integrate non-state actors in the decision making and look beyond the line to the actual territories that are on either side and all the people and the concerns and the activities that are happening there. And so the recognition was you can't actually do it by yourself. We need everybody's perspectives. There's a lot of interests at play. And unless all of the actors are at the table, you're not going to get a robust solution that sticks. It's really hard for governments to just impose something, as we know, right? The level of enforcement, the things like that. So that's why we created what's called our international watershed boards. It makes sense environmentally. Water operates at watershed levels, but it also makes sense socially and economically. All of these interests fit together. The other thing I would just mention is the pressure put on by non-state actors is often what gets references done. The fact that, and look at the Oonagh as a perfect example, they were tireless advocates for this, and lots of other people were also, but they are a unique group of non-Canada-US state actors, right? They are rights holders, they are governments, they are nations, and they have interests that were never taken into account as our country evolved, as, you know, through colonization. We all know that story. And their voices, the persistence of their voices, and their willingness to find, and their creativity in finding solutions that allow kind of the Crown, different state governments to come to the table while also recognizing their role, I think will be the source of the most evolution of water governance and water policy and everything in the next 10 to 20 years. I don't know if the ELK is going to finish in a way that everybody's happy with. I don't know if it'll continue. I don't know what the outcomes will be of that, but it is a very exciting experiment. And I think it holds the germ of what actually is possible for, you know, quote unquote, non-state actors to do, especially if they're governments like Indigenous governments are.
Thank you very much, Merrell-Ann. Yeah, Nigel, if you want to add something maybe on the fact that I mean you talked about it a little bit before about the fact that Columbia Basin Indigenous nations were observers, right, during the negotiations on the Columbia, and you mentioned also that this Indigenous-led advisory body that was in the agreement in principle.
Yeah, so maybe just a few comments, partly on the Columbia, partly on other issues. So first of all, just to build on what Merrell-Ann just said, the IJC's levels orders do provide tremendous opportunity for citizen engagement in terms of both an annual reporting, but also reopening the orders from time to time to allow new interests and values to be considered. So maybe you've already answered this question, Merrell-Ann, the one from John Schertz in relation to the Kootenay. So there's a reopening there, which, you know, provides huge opportunities for citizen engagement. And the nice thing about these levels orders is that the IJC has continuing jurisdiction, right? It doesn't need a new reference. I mean, sometimes it might get a new reference, but it doesn't need it for the Board of Control to take it upon itself to say, well, it's time to revisit this, maybe with direction from commissioners. Second, in relation to the CRT, yeah, we've seen a tremendous evolution from 64 to now. And I think it's fair to say that BC's engagement, both with nations, but also with local governments, was significant. Let's put it that way, significant throughout the process. What I would say, slightly qualifying what you said, Marguerite, is the nations were not there on the Canadian side of the table as observers. They were actually part of the delegation, and in some cases making the presentation on a Canadian issue. So it went far beyond, you know, simply watching a process. It was full engagement in the process, and that was a very significant change for international treaty negotiations. And the final thing, it kind of builds a bit on what Merrell-Ann said. When my first engagement with boundary water issues was actually in relation to the Skagit River in British Columbia, close to Vancouver. The Skagit is held near and dear by many Vancouverites and Fraser Valley residents as a wilderness recreation area, but the Skagit is dammed in the United States by the Ross Dam, which was built during the wartime, with an allowance for the dam to be raised at some point, which would have flooded back into more Canadian territory. And there was an organization put in place called the Ross Committee, after the name of the dam, but its acronym was Run Out Skagit Spoilers. And tremendous public pressure, resulting ultimately in a new treaty relating to both the Skagit and the 7 Mile facility, in which BC Hydro essentially offered power to Seattle City Light, the utility owning and operating the Ross Dam. Don't raise the dam, we'll offer an offsetting power benefit. Why did that happen? It happened because of public opposition to that. So so that's an historical example. This is going back to the early 1980s, but yeah. So just some maybe longer food for thought than you were hoping for, Marguerite.
No, that's great. There's one question that maybe you would be interested in answering, or others on the panel. Given the trend in BC and in Canada for title and rights land claims over First Nations traditional territories, e.g. Cowichan and Musqueam, and the general support of provincial and federal courts to judge on the side of First Nations, do you think that rights and titles will play more favorably for the future of Columbia Basin First Nations in terms of negotiating for meaningful and equitable benefit sharing for tribes and First Nations? I don't know if, Nigel, you have a
Well, I simply say I understand that there is a continuing negotiating table on compensation and sharing issues, and that's ongoing, but I'm not privy to the details.
I don't know if Riley or Richard, you want to you have anything you'd like to add to the. Otherwise, there are a couple of.
I can answer if nobody else wants to speak just to that, because so when rights and title issues are no longer something we fight about, but something that people recognize, I think you still are left with the question of how to do this then. What are we going to do? I often say one of the reasons I support collaborative governance as a negotiating process, as something we do, is because, and you heard me say it at the beginning, I step over the fight about the fine points of jurisdiction, who has what, and I say, listen, we know you have rights and or title or something, and even under the Indian Act there is authority there, like they are governments one way or another, lots of different bases for it, including many nations I work with, their view that governance comes from the creator. Like, regardless of fighting about what the scope of that is, the reality is they exist as an wrongly excluded part of our governance fabric. And so we can do the whole thing of go to court and get it all recognized, and many nations do that, and I support them if they do that. They have to do, but at the end of the day, you still have to find a way to say, okay, so there are numerous jurisdictions with numerous governments that have to come to an acceptable resolution to them all. And I think that rights and title, increasing rights and title recognitions, will hopefully move that conversation out of the realm of consultation into the realm of co-governance tables and conversations, where we're no longer trying to delineate who has what, but we're actually trying to say, what can we do together? Let's form an agreement around what we are going to do to address this water issue and things like that. And that sounds a little bit, I know, like Pollyanna, except I've seen it happen. I've seen numerous tables do it if they just approach it that way. And that's what I think is in many ways happening at the Elk. But, as I said, we'll see. So I do think that, yes, it will have an impact, a positive one.
Thank you very much. Riley and Richard, we have to keep it brief if possible.
I'll try to be very brief, just to kind of expand or follow up with what Merrell-Ann said and Nigel said. I think the strength of Indigenous title and rights claims is why you see they had such a strong position in regards to the modernization of the. I think in the end, it turns out to be it's good governance to incorporate them, and it's good governance to avoid conflicts. I think it creates a more resilient agreement. And I think, the same thing I said about cooperation. Cooperation is in everyone's interest. I think the same is true here. Whether or not what becomes of the negotiations, I don't know. But I think the First Nations groups have a very strong claim to be included in the conversation on the Columbia and shared transboundary watercourses.
Thank you.
Yeah, I totally agree with Merrell-Ann. I sometimes worry that there's a lot of focus on rights and not so much on responsibilities. I always thought of the two as flip sides of each other. And whenever people go on and on and on about their rights, I sometimes, even with my kids, I try to slide in the responsibility side, and there's sort of blank looks. And I worry that that's not a good path to go down. I worry also that a little bit that this focus on compensation and reparations and so on, the good governance of of any river system gets lost in the shuffle then, right? Because it takes a lot of time and money and energy to focus on compensation and reparations and so on and so forth. So that's the thing. On the Elk, I can't resist. I think managing expectations is going to be huge. Selenium, in my experience, is a incredibly complicated and insidious element, and expectations are through the stratosphere in the Elk Valley on that one, and I'm not sure that the ability or willingness of Glencore to deliver is there. So we'll see. So.
Thank you, Richard. There's a couple of questions that I'll read to all of you in case you'd like to answer it. Does Canada and BC's adoption of UNDRIP change how Canada approaches the Boundary Waters Treaty and IJC references? We see that in the Elk reference, but it's unclear if the UNDA, the UN Declarations Act, was a driving force, and whether Canada will do more of that joint reference work because of the UNDA. And the second one is, I wonder if the panel could comment on the availability of IJC remedies for Indigenous peoples and NGOs, including whether the IJC has or should have funding for such remedies.
I'll take the second one first from Franklin. Hello, Franklin. So that in the sense that because I know you're a lawyer, the sense of remedies, we don't have remedies in that sense. I think the Elk is instructive in terms of the type of remedy. It's like an international law scope, right? The IJC, because I strongly support Indigenous governance roles. Personally, that's all my work. I push for that to be representation on all the IJC boards, for example, and to form part of IJC programming and to have everything from people involved in decisions to advising to a whole bunch of things. But at the end of the day, I don't think there's a remedy in the sense you might mean, because there's not really any remedy in the sense you might mean through the IJC. This is all a diplomatic process. I don't think we've ever been tested on our orders. If somebody is not in compliance with an order repeatedly, what would be the remedy there? But that's the closest it comes to the kind of thing you're talking about. The other piece, funding though, absolutely. Both Canada and the US a number of years ago told us, do more with Indigenous peoples. At that time, it was consultation was the frame and engagement. For us, it's evolved into all levels, all ways, all directions, as much as we can if Indigenous nations are interested. But it's very costly, as the elk shows you, and time consuming to build relationships, particularly meaningful ones that are ongoing, to actually do something better with the water. And so, yeah, our funding hasn't been increased in over 20 years, IJC's funding, maybe longer. And we do more and more work on this. So it's absolutely, this sounds like a funding pitch, but we need it to do a good job, of course. Yeah, so do Indigenous nations, because they're not funded to do this kind of work either. And I will leave that.
Go ahead, Nigel.
Yeah, just to comment briefly on Franklin's question. There is one interesting example of, I'm sure there are more, of nations seeking remedies under old levels order. And the example I'm referring to is actually Grand Coulee. So Grand Coulee, the big dam on the main stem of the Columbia, backs up into Canada in the form of Lake Roosevelt. As a result of that, it required IJC approval. And it got that approval, notwithstanding the fact that Grand Coulee was going to decimate, well, more than decimate, eradicate anadromous salmon in the Upper Columbia. About 20 years ago, it must be now, nations in Canada brought an application to the IJC asking them to revisit that order, arguing that their interests were affected and had never been taken into account, also bringing in general international law arguments in terms of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. It didn't go anywhere. There were, of course, objections from both the US and Canada Foreign Affairs departments as to whether or not the IJC could look at. But it's an example of sort of an imaginative use in a very important context of nations trying to use the IJC's sort of standing jurisdiction over these levels orders. Second question about UNDRIP. I think did it have an influence? We don't know, I don't think. Should it have had an influence? Absolutely, because both British Columbia and Canada have passed UNDRIP implementation legislation, and the Supreme Court has affirmed that makes it part of the law of Canada, and you have a duty to observe its contents. So I think my answer to the question is it should have, and maybe we'll see a clearer articulation of that as time goes and we work through the implications of domestic implementation, assisted by some very broad comments from the Supreme Court.
Thank you very much, Nigel. I don't know if any of you has more comments. Otherwise, maybe we'll move to the last question, unless we get additional questions from the audience. But we do have 5 minutes left to address the last question I had for you. So maybe we can they can be a bit concluding remarks or a bit short. Looking ahead, what do you see as challenges and or opportunities for Canada in terms of transboundary water cooperation? Sure, go ahead, Riley.
I think kind of for me the challenges and opportunities kind of go hand in hand. I think the our the level of integration and cooperation I think is a great opportunity to go forward. It's a challenge to make sure that that continues in a productive way as it has. I think there's probably a real challenge. I talked a bit about bulk water transfers, but I do think there may become increasing pressure on Canada in regards to its water resources. And I do think that perhaps, when we talk about bulk water transfers, one thing I didn't talk about was virtual water. The idea that we export a lot of water in the goods we produce in Canada. There's an embedded cost. And I think looking currently, I was just reading the Alberta and federal MOU. And I noticed that in a relatively short document, data centers comes up 5 times. We don't really know the implications of the energy and water consumption, except that there will probably be a lot. If we talk about data centers, there's some proposed data centers already in within Canada being put forward. Up by Grand Prairie, there's supposedly the world's largest being proposed. But I think these are things that we need to think about. So anyway, I'll try to be quick.
Please go ahead, Merrell-Ann.
So I've got three sort of comments, I guess. One is just it's a real challenge when water is weaponized in rhetoric. I work in the diplomatic sphere, obviously, through the IJC, and water matters at all levels to many people. And so it just it puts strain on the cooperative norms, really, that underpin institutions like the IJC. So that's a big challenge. And it's not just on water, it's on everything, but it is a real issue. We're trying to just lower the temperature and calm things down a bit when it comes to the fear around those things. Another challenge I think that is, and I mentioned it already, is political will. The treaty was designed for high conflict situations. That's not incidental to its architecture, that's the whole point of it. And so the question, when you hear stuff about bulk water transfers and AI data centers and stuff, that's really climate-driven hydrological events. These are big, scary potentialities. And my first question isn't whether the treaty covers it, it's whether or not there's the political will to apply the treaty. Because I think in most cases the treaty can cover these things and the parties could agree to use a mechanism to try to resolve some of these potential conflict points. And so it's just, whether there's the political will to invoke it, the treaty, to follow it, to fund it, and then to stay out of it. Because once we're working, political interference doesn't help, right? We need to be independent and we need to do this job in a credible way. And so that's, I think, a big concern. The blurring between the role of the political mechanisms. I mean, it's just really, if you look around the world, we're in a real crisis, a real set of changes on that. So, and maybe the final point I'll just say is the Indigenous, you can look at the number of questions that have happened, and even in this brief time of our conversation here today, on the role of Indigenous nations. And I think there's some thinking that maybe the elk is just a one-shot deal or whatever, but the Canada and the US manage their relationships with Indigenous nations very different legal traditions, for sure. But I don't think the issue is going away. It shouldn't go away. It's fundamental to our development as a nations, that this be dealt with properly and respectfully. And so that's, I think, a big, huge opportunity for long-term change, but also a big concern for a lot of people, how to do that. And so I think I'll stop with that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Merrell-Ann. Nigel or Richard, do you want to comment on this question?
Sure, a little. I mean, I would start by celebrating, right? I'd celebrate the achievements of the International Joint Commission over its very long existence, and the fact that it is still doing good work. It is still getting references, not as quickly as many of us would like to have them referred to the IJC. But I mean, the ALK reference is just getting the reference is a huge achievement that speaks to the faith of governments in the IJC and the faith in shared science, now informed by Indigenous knowledge, which has been a hallmark of the IJC's work, because the work isn't done, with all deference to Merrell-Ann, by the commissioners. It's done by the study groups, the binational science that's brought together, and I think is perhaps the greatest tradition of the IJC. In terms of challenges, I go back to my first question to Merrell-Ann. I think that the challenge is creating the environment, and I think Merrell-Ann put it in terms of political will, which I think really captures it, in which references are possible. And the one area where I think we perhaps need to see some movement is on the Panhandle. So the Alsek, Tatshenshini, Taku, Stikine rivers with upstream mining developments in Canada, causing downstream risks in the United States, concerns for salmon, long-standing requests for a reference, and we're not seeing it. I mean, British Columbia is the butt of much of this, right, as the upstream state, and as Richard pointed out, a tough experience on Cabin Creek Flathead some decades ago. But I think it's a continuing challenge, I think, where references are sought and Stonewall may be too hard, but long time to get progress.
Thank you, Nigel.
Yeah,
Go ahead, Richard.
I just agree, reinforce what Nigel said. I think the opportunity, when the Alaskans used to ask me what I thought and what they should, how did I feel about the IJC? I said, after Cabin Creek, it was hopeless. I mean, don't waste your time and energy. But I think that you're shifting that. And as long as you're able to manage expectations with selenium, which is a big job, I think there's real hope for going forward. I think also the challenge going forward in the Columbia is going to be a little more difficult or equally challenging. I see a real opportunity, but I mean, on the challenge side, there is this frustration. There is this, we put our hearts and souls and energy and effort into all these public meetings and consultation, and we got this interim arrangements that give this is how they perceive it, everything they wanted, and we get nothing in return. What's the story here? But I see an opportunity here as well, because some people in the Kootenays and in the States have been pushing the idea of an international river basin organization for quite a while. And one of the many answers was always, no, we're involved in these negotiations on the Columbia. Now is a bad time to do that. But now that they've seen that the Columbia negotiations have not ended as some had hoped they might, maybe there's renewed interest in that. Maybe a door closes, but a window opens. So I'm cautiously optimistic moving forward that may be a result. And then if you combine that with some sort of ecological disaster, a flood or a drought or some combination of the two, maybe that'll be the added incentive to move things forward.
Thank you, Richard. Any final comment from any of you on this question?
Well, just say
go ahead.
I celebrated the IJC. I think we should also celebrate the Columbia River Treaty. The problem there hasn't been compliance, right? The problem has been scope. there's been near perfect compliance with the terms of the treaty. The entities have done a fabulous job of cooperating at a technical level over 60 plus years. The problem is scope and participation or non-participation as a result of the the focus being on the operating entities rather than the wider public and a wider set of values.
Thank you, Nigel. Merrell-Ann, we have a.
I'll be 3 seconds. Well, maybe a bit more. I just wanted to second Nigel's comment about the Columbia River and just say, Paul Allen asked a really interesting question about water as a security issue. And I guess the idea I'd like to leave people with is to envision, maybe in Canada at least, a world where water security is a pillar of Canadian sovereignty. And I said that in the comment. Not defensively, not militarized, but as an affirmative kind of national project that integrates Indigenous governance, climate resilience, climate change, and international legal leadership. I think we have an exportable, interesting model of how we get along. And I just imagine it as being foundation to our sovereignty. And just put that out there for people to think about.
Thank you very much, Merrell-Ann. We had just one little comment saying that the RBO discussion continues through the continuance of the university's consortium. I have to close a bit the conversation. We have 5 minutes from the end of the webinar. And you've been fantastic at answering questions throughout the webinar now. So I don't know, Oonagh, if we'll have time to let each of the 4 panelists to provide us with a key takeaway from the conversation. But yes, okay. So if you can, each of you, if you have a key takeaway you'd like to provide, a very short one.
Well, I'll be very short, but I think my key takeaway is a long established history of cooperation and one that actually informed the broader development of international water law beyond Canada.
Thank you.
Much the same celebration, as I've already said. So maybe that's too self-satisfied, but I think we can take pride in both the Boundary Waters Treaty and IJC as institutions and the Columbia.
My takeaway is just creative reinterpretations of things that we think are just the status quo is a useful tactic when things are really full of conflict. That's all. And I just think that there's a huge opportunity there if we can step back and look at that. And that's a key takeaway I had today. Thank you.
Thank you, Merrell-Ann. Richard?
Sure. Well, I think in these perilous times, politically, at least everywhere in the world, I take great solace in the old Martin Luther King Jr. quote that the arc of the moral universe runs long, but it bends towards justice. And I think that's important to keep in mind. And I think about that. And I think it's true in the water world as well as everywhere else. So even though we get discouraged or frustrated, I think it's important that there is a bend towards justice. I sure hope there is anyway. So.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you very much to the 4 of you for the great, fantastic discussion. It's been hard to not jump in and contribute or ask follow-up questions to let you discuss between yourselves and let the audience ask questions. But yeah, we've had really great questions from the audience as well. I'll hand it back to you,
Thank you very much, Marguerite. And on behalf of everyone on this webinar, I'd like to thank you all. I'd like to thank Merrell-Ann Phare, Nigel Banks, Richard Paisley, Riley Denoon, and of course, Marguerite as your your moderator, for providing so much useful information and insight today, and also for lifting us up and giving us hope on this really important issue that combines the dimensions of social dimensions and environmental dimensions, and this promise of cooperative international law. So with that, I thank you all, and I would ask that you continue to follow ILA Canada and the International Law Association on our respective websites and social media for our next events. I did post in the chat one event that's coming up, which is related to the speech that Carney made at Davos, and that's an event we're doing with the Canadian Council of International Law, the Société Québécoise de Droit International, as well as ILA Canada. So that's going to be an exciting event later this month. Alors, au nom de tous les participants, je voudrais remercier les panélistes. Ça veut dire Merrell-Ann, Nigel, Richard, Riley, et aussi notre modératrice, Marguerite. Et I wish you all a very wonderful evening, and je vous souhaite une excellente soirée. Merci beaucoup. Bye bye.
Merci beaucoup. Thank
Merci
you all.
beaucoup. Thank you.
Thank you very much.